Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 18th Psalm. This is a rather famous one. This is David's expression of thanksgiving as a consequence for his military success. He offers the praise and the honor and the esteem to the one who was responsible. So the secret to David's greatness was not himself, but the God who worked through him powerfully. And because all scripture is inspired, that means even the one that is not verse. So in the Psalms, we do encounter titles to psalms that are not listed in or numbered as verses, but they are still inspired and therefore worthy of dissection. So the title of this one reads, "To the chief singer of David, the servant of Yahweh, who spoke to Yahweh the words of this song, in the day Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies, and from the hand of Saul, he said." Psalms were originally sung in liturgical worship, and David was a composer and a musician. He was a polymath, he was a man of war, but he was also a man after God's own heart, and we find that heart here in these songs that he composed to him, and he is identified as his servant. So what I want to suggest is that the paradoxical concept of servant leadership in the New Testament is not as novel as it seems. It's really rooted in the Old, because Moses, Joshua, the prophets, and the king, David, are identified as servants. So the king, as much as the commoner, was bound by the law of Moses. In fact, they were commanded to carry a portable copy with them at all times. So David was the man after God's own heart. He was his servant, and he was successful because he was a servant. And also, he who is not submitted to authority cannot be trusted to execute authority. So we do have to pray for godly leaders, and David is the model and the example. And now as to the when of this occasion, what motivated him was the day that he was emerged victorious from the hand of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. The latter would have occurred before the former, because even after he emerged unscathed and Saul was killed in battle and the anointing fell to him, he did not have this instant path to success. He was surrounded by enemies internal. The dynasty of Saul did put up a fight, even though most of his able-bodied sons were killed in the battle with him. But when he was delivered from all his enemies, this could have taken place any time after either 2 Samuel 5, 8, or 10. Those chapters describe him subduing his enemies, but, not for long. So it could have been at any one of these occasions or all three. And what did he say? "I love you, O Yahweh, my strength." Now, the historical context, now in the version that this has a parallel version in 2 Samuel 22nd chapter, and the reason that is included at the tail end is because it is known as an inclusio, which is a capstone. So the 1 Samuel begins with a poem and a prayer, a poetic prayer by Hannah, and then it's placed there for that reason, even though it occurred earlier. But we read the same, every line except this one is duplicated verbatim in these chapters. So what he says here is the love. Now, the love is not an ordinary type of love. It is, in fact, a lavish love, an intense longing used to describe the love that a mother bears for her child. And that is the way that the servant was to his father, the source of his strength. David was a physically strong man, but the secret to his strength was not the might of his own arm, but the omnipotent one who resided in him and just enabled him to vanquish all his enemies and foes. David did not have an easy life. He had a life defined by struggle. So the path to the kingship was anything but rosy. It was shed with blood, but David was a warrior as well as a man after God's own heart. And the warrior mentality is reflected in the second verse. So from henceforth, now there's it more or less corresponds to what we read of in the 22nd chapter of 2 Samuel. "Yahweh is my rock and my stronghold and my deliverer. My El is my rock. I take refuge in him. My shield in the horn of salvation, my high tower." In there we read 7 things. He is a rock, he is a stronghold, a fortress, that's 2. The deliverer, the source of his salvation, that's 3. a rock again, a source of refuge. We can count that as the fourth one, since rock is repeated elsewhere. And shield is 5, and 6 is horn, and 7 is the high tower. So all these things are physical metaphors, which are sources of strength. Rock is something of stability and duration. It is referred to, this has a poetic parallel and overlap with Moses's song that he offers also as an inclusio at the book of Deuteronomy, the 33rd chapter. He describes Yahweh as a rock about, at least a handful of times in that thing. So that concept. And Hannah also refers to the rock of Israel, but whereas David takes a different perspective, he refers to the rock as a personal pronoun. So he is the secret of Israel's success, but he's also the secret of David's success. He is personal and collective. We have to have him. We can claim him as our rock if our faith is strong enough. In our stronghold, now this is a fortress. Now when David was on the run from Saul, he sought refuge in a stronghold, the fortress in Philistine territory, or maybe even to the north at one time. He was on the run from Saul, so he took refuge in a stronghold. Deliverer, this is a salvation psalm. It's all about the deliverance and rescue and the victory and the overcoming to start to finish. So Yahweh can save the righteous, but he is not obligated. He cannot save the wicked who do not long after him. And the source of refuge that rings a bell in Psalm 46:1, be still and know, that I am, and also that he is a refuge, a source of solace and security and peace and serenity, a shield, a physical shield. Now he is a shield that protects us from spiritual dangers as well as physical ones. If you were in David's shoes, he would have functioned in a less than metaphorical physical shield. And the horn of my salvation, horn is the symbol of strength. So in the ancient world, so the strength in the salvation, he is strong enough to execute and he is the high tower, the highest tower of all. He is the exalted one who sits enthroned on eternity, and there is no tower higher than him. I call upon Yahweh, the one to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. It's not as simple as it might appear to suggest. He had to pray. It was not one time, but it was repeatedly. But he gives the praise even when he wasn't, while he was praying to be rescued and he was on the run in the emergency. Prayer is the engine which sustained David's struggle. So without hope, struggle is meaningless. Hope is the engine which motivates one to persist past the struggling. So David he had several near-death experiences. He could have died so many times. He was in battlefield, all his life, but he did not, and he always won. So of course he would be praised. And he had been consistently saved from enemies. The existence of enemies is not a testament to one's own unrighteousness. To quote Winston Churchill, if you have lived life with enemies, that means you stood for something. So David did stand for something significant. He was Yahweh's anointed, the anointed king of Israel, and he would not surrender from where he stands. So there was enemies within the kingdom and enemies without, but he subdued them one by one. But it was not an instantaneous, he did not have all the things, all the palaces. He was exalted from the sheepfold to the throne. The cords of death surrounded me, and the floods of Baal made me afraid. He's surrounded by death. His life is precious, and his life is in mortal danger when he was fleeing from Saul or when he is in battle. You are surrounded by death. There are people literally dying as far as the eye can see in battle. So the skill to emerge unkilled from battle would have demanded a special skill just to even make it out alive in hand-to-hand combat. But David was able to do that, and he also uses metaphorically, he transitions into a testimony of nature, natural revelation through which the power of his Elohim manifests. The cords of the grave were all around me. The snares of death were before me. Now, the grave, the cords of death, cords of the grave, these are synonymous but not identical terms. But once more, they are surrounding him. They were all around me. So we do witness a parallelism in the 4th and 5th verses. Then the snares of death were before me. So all around him is the cords of death, just trying to suck him in, squeeze him in. And right in front of him, before me, before his very face, is the snare of death. So he is writing from a man whose life was endangered, and he did emerge victorious and triumphant through the power and the presence of Yahweh. In my distress I called upon Yahweh, and to Elohim I cried. He heard my voice from his temple, and my cry went before him into his ears. David was living, he had dilemmas of distress. He was in distressing situations, but that is where his prayer becomes most palpable. Really, the emergency prayer to someone who has had the fair weather and the foul weather faith is going to be something meaningful. That is what he once more cries to Yahweh. He calls upon him in the 3rd verse. We hear him crying unto me. Now, that is not crying in the sense of tearing. It is shouting to the high heavens to him, speaking to him with passionate intensity, but he has the assurance that he is heard in his temple. Now, that word is alternately translated as sanctuary, because there was no temple to speak of it at this time, but also in the 27th Psalm and the few other places, David speaks of a temple, even though it had not yet existed. He, being a man after God's own heart, he desired above all else to be the one to build the temple, but he had to accept by faith the rejection of his plan because he had too much blood on his hands. But that's another story. And, his cry goes before him. So before him are the snares of death, but before Yahweh are the cries of David, his loud prayers and petitions, and they're in his ear, and he takes notice. And how does he respond? And the earth shook and trembled, even the foundations of the mountains were troubled, and they shook because he was wroth. So in his almighty wrath, his wrath is always and only righteous, but so powerful and so profound and so earth-shattering that even the mountains quake when he gets angry. This is just an expression of his sovereign omnipotence over creation. The mountains, he can make them tremble. He can uproot them from the ground of the earth. And we also have the promise in the New Testament that we can move mountains if our faith is strong enough. Now, I cannot conceive of a realistic hypothetical in which that miracle would be necessary. So I think it's a lot more healthy to interpret the mountains in those passages as obstacles, mountains that we can overcome through faith. Faith was the ingredient that sustained David and enabled him to survive. Faith can do the same for us. If we are persistent, if we are willing, and if we are diligent, and we are willing to pay the prices. The life of faith is not easy, but so too it's a lot harder to be a sinner. Proverbs 15, the way of the sinner, the transgressor, is hard. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and consuming fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. Smoke, fire, heat are just even light, and just these clouds of darkness were some of the ways that he presented himself. So smoke is often, I think at Sinai, he came, there was a smoke attendant at that occasion, and the smoke is just coming from his nostrils. The his is capitalized. That means that they're Yahweh's. And he is a consuming fire in himself. Deuteronomy 4:24, also Hebrews 12:29, and consuming fire emanates from his mouth, and this fire has a contagious effect that spreads to coals and on the skins of those who are wicked, those who he is wrathful at. And he bowed the heavens and came down, and dense cloud was under his feet. Dense cloud is another physically normative perception to theophanies. So he is an invisible being, but he makes his presence obvious through physical forms, one of which is a dense cloud. So that's how he was the source of light to the Exodus generation, but the same light was perceived as darkness by the enemies of Israel while they were escaping early from the Egypt in the early Exodus. But he is the creator and the controllers of the heavens and the earth. So when he comes down, when he condescends, now we say that word, humanly speaking, we think of someone who looks down their nose, but condescending in the divine sense is actually an act of humility. It's where he comes down from his lofty throne on heaven and condescends to the earth to make himself known to man. And the ultimate condescension was the incarnation. And he rode up on a cherub and flew upon the wings of the wind. Cherubs are angelic beings. One of them was guarding Eden. This was the the revelatory calling of Ezekiel. There were cherub presence. These are angelic heavenly beings, but unusual in strength and significance. So he's describing this vision of Yahweh's might coming in him, just all the physical phenomenon used metaphorically, just the wings of the wind. So the wind is incomprehensible, but it is also likened to the movements of the Spirit. The Spirit's movement is likened to the wind in John 3:8. He made darkness his covering, around him his booth, darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. Now, 1 John 1:5 says, Elohim is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. And he is both light, but he is also darkness. He is not limited to light alone. He often, presents himself and conceals himself in the form of darkness, because so sacred is his presence that for any human naked eye to look upon it would result in a fatal casualty. But the darkness of waters and just the thick clouds of the sky. Remember, nature, the sky, the sea, and the earth, the continental land masses are under his control, and he's able to do what he wants at will. He can move a continent as far as he likes at any given moment in time. That's just one of the things he can do. From the brightness before him, his thick clouds passed, hail and coals of fire. So he was darkness. Now he reveals himself to be light. So the darkness is really a cloaking of his truant, because he is so radiant. But remember that the darkness was used as his covering to hide him, to conceal his full majesty. But once the brightness comes, it's an irresistible force. So all these thick clouds come and go, and all these forms of painful precipitation. Hail is nothing pleasant to be hit at. It is harder than snow and somewhat ice-like form of precipitation. And coals of fire, nothing pleasant. Your physical flesh is going to burn at the touch of coals of fire. And Yahweh thundered in the heavens, and the Most High sent forth his voice. Hail and coals of fire. Thunder. Now, the 29th Psalm is perhaps the most extensive treatment on the voice of Yahweh, and it is likened to thunder in that passage. So that's one of the ways he speaks, by thunder. We read something similar from the mouth of Elihu in Job's 37th chapter, before Yahweh condescends himself in the form of a whirlwind. So he is not limited to any one of the aforementioned things, or even what we read in that. But, the coals once there, and just his voice is this irresistible force at whom hail and coals of fire, we read for the second time in 2 verses, emanate from and spread. And he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and much lightning, and confused them. Lightning is one of the, thunder is how his voice is described, but lightning is just something that can accompany. The ancients all alike ascribe supernatural forces at work to lightning and just these exciting, unusual phenomenon in the sky. So the Hebrews were not unique in this. But he also describes him as throwing arrows in enemies and scattering his enemies who are surrounding David and trying to kill him. He has the all-powerful ally in the sky, the one you don't want to mess with, and the one who you really want in your corner. And the channels of water were seen, and the fountains of the foundations of the world were uncovered. At your rebuke, O Yahweh, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. This has a reference, and this image does have a distinct reference point in the Exodus experience when the the parting of the Red Sea. So what happens was the foundation of the world were uncovered. It was once covered in sea, but now it is uncovered through the blast of his nostrils, which is what parted the waves for the Israelites to pass unmolested, walk through it. And by the time the Egyptians, the final Israelite was there, the Egyptians just got swallowed by the sea. So they were rebuked for their 430 years of oppressing his people. And the nation, the army of Pharaoh drowned. And, the blast of the breath of his nostrils, there is power to that can shake the earth and move mountains and cause continents to shake. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. Now, David was never, drowning was not a near-death experience, as we know, but David was no stranger to now-death experience, so to be drawn out of waters, many waters, means to be at the mercy of those waters, and to be drawn out is to be rescued from drowning in the waters. So this, what kept him from sinking to below was the one above. He took him, he rescued him, he saved him from drowning, even though there is no reference to the Bible in any situation where David was in danger of drowning. But he does describe his thirst, his love in the form of a thirst for Yahweh. Psalm 42:1 and also 63:1-3, somewhere in that range. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from those hating me, for they were stronger than I. David was at the mercy of forces that were substantially more powerful than him. When he was on the run in the woods, he encouraged defectors from all the 12 tribes of Israel, but ultimately Saul had the full might of the Israeli army on the search for him, and this compelled him to seek refuge at certain times and then return to fight some things. But, he was ultimately a guest of the Philistines at one point, but Saul hated him because he knew that the power, the spirit, had departed from him. So Saul's downfall really comes in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel when he disobeys the direct order to genocide the Amalekite people. He keeps their king alive in the hopes of bartering him, but the prophet Samuel slays him himself when he exits the scene and pronounces Saul's punishment. The spirit departed from him. Now the anointing goes to David in the 16th chapter, and then in the 14th verse of that chapter we read that the spirit that had once visited and overwhelmed, and Saul prophesied through that spirit, had departed him. So it was an evil spirit, one that terrorized him with fear. And so his servants solicited the services of a musician to calm and soothe. And David, who had the magic touch with the harp in the presence of God that could soothe Saul's spirit, but he also became a warrior. And then he incurred Saul's envy because his military prowess eclipsed his own eventually. By the 7th verse of the 18th chapter, they're shouting, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his tens of thousands, and henceforth he kept a close eye on him and conspires to kill him by the 19th chapter. And he says he became his enemy for life. So great was the hatred that he bore for him. But, David was also outnumbered in certain other military, because remember, this is describing not only his victory over Saul, but also his victories over his foreign enemies. So remember the Samuel time frame. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but Yahweh was my support. His strength, there is no obstacle or disaster that is too overwhelming for the strength of his support. So the day of your calamity, that was also the day of his deliverance. That's when he defeated those who confronted him in his hour of maximum danger. In his hour of maximum danger, his strength, his shield, his fortress, his everything we read in the 2nd verse was there for him. He was his strength, he was his support, he was his power, and he was his source of victory. He's the one, so once more the secret to David's success was not David, but the God who worked in him through him and around him. And he brought me out into a large place. He delivered me, for he delighted in me. He delighted in David because David delighted in him. He was described by God himself as a man after his own heart, Acts 13:22. So he delighted in fighting and struggling and suffering for the sake of Yahweh, because he knew he had the ironclad certainty that he would one day rule. And when he ruled, he would also, continually be successful in military battle. He would fight Israel's battles and lead them to outstanding victories and make them a force to be reckoned with. During the periods of Judges, they were vulnerable. They were bullied and oppressed by all the adjacent civilizations one by one. But David finally gave them the strength to be at peace. So his path of warfare enabled his son to pursue the path of peace. We're going to close up here. The 19th verse represents the first of the 3 sections of the 18th chapter of Psalm. We don't know how we're going to arrange the remainder, but we will pick this up start to finish sometime soon. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.